Stoddard of Cambridge University.
There is a very strong similarity between different attitudes to death in the sense of process. Death, for us, is something that is medical, but in many ancient societies, it is a process. The waiting room sits astride that last breath. And indeed, it's very, very important for most societies to place that dead person in a process of proper treatment, whereby they are laid out, buried, and interred, and often, in some societies, returned to honour at a series of different clear moments.
Director of Death and Life Studies at Durham University, Professor Douglas Davis.
We have a great problem in talking about a moment, as though it's a split second. In many cultures and historically, death is usually a period. So I think it's good for us at the outset to think of the period of dying rather than the moment of death.
So that particular literal moment of transition is obviously an incredibly important focal point and a very dramatic one. And how do different religions prepare for that moment, both obviously for the person who is dying, but also for those around him or her?
A good place to start would be within the general Indian tradition, Hinduism and Sikhism, where the living are trying to provide the consciousness with the right attitude. So the chanting of sacred scriptures, having a priest chanting with the dying person, trying to get their mind focused on ultimacy, on the deity, as they pass from one place of consciousness to another place of consciousness, the intermediate worlds, before that life force goes on into its transmigration, into its potential reincarnation.
So is that feeling about, as you say, has life ended, or is it just gone into another form, another consciousness? Is that a very general feeling amongst most religious traditions, that we move into another world, moving from the material to the spiritual?
I think it is because the human animal has this sense of what some people might call, well, life force animacy. We are very used to things having life about them. And one way the human animal has coped with this is to think there is another environment, there is another world. That life force must be somewhere.
From the Islamic Centre of England, Imam Syed Muhammad Razavi.
We as Muslims believe that God has created us to live forever. Once the person has died, then you should keep on reciting the verses of Holy Quran around the dead body until it is prepared for shrouding and washing. And when someone dies, this is not end of their life. They have continued their life into a metaphysical dimension. And that's the common belief between Christian Jews and Muslims, that God initially created us in metaphysical dimension, then sent us to live in physical dimension in this world. And therefore, in Islamic teachings, when a person dies, we don't say he's died. We say he's been transferred from physical dimension to metaphysical dimension.
So I think that this is a very extensive human response in creating an alternative environment into which the dying person now passes into a new life.
So in a way, is it also for those who are left behind, so to speak, by thinking of an afterlife or some period of transition, that we are going through that transition? It allows us to let that person who is just deceased go away from us in some emotional way.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. And in a sense, Buddhism does that to us. Many people would be familiar in general, at least, with this idea of the Tibetan Book of the Dead. There are other books of the dead, where a religious specialist is now going to, as it were, talk the person into the other world and is giving them instructions on what they are now feeling as they move from this moment to the next moment.
Abbot Ajahn Amaro from the Amaravati Buddhist Monastery in southern England told me about the importance of the positive support he would offer.
Very natural for family or friends or someone like myself, a monk or a spiritual counsellor, to come along and say, well, look, you've got nothing to worry about, you lived a very good life, you're a kind person. And then in our particular Buddhist dialect, it's called Chaganusati, remembering your own goodness. That can then serve to outweigh the murmurings of anxiety and trepidation. That brightness then serves as a basis for the mind to become more relaxed and more peaceful, and then being ready to accept the changes that are happening. That's what's really going to help the person most of all.
This is really important, I think, the sense that the living have a responsibility for the dying, which is why, in many traditions, to die away from home becomes problematic.
Many attitudes to death are related to identity.
Anthropologist Dr. Simon Stoddard again.
How we treat our dead is a reflection of how we see ourselves in the world. When did this first start? And it looks as though, at least from 30,000 years ago, there was an intentional placing of the dead. And so that careful treatment begins to come into focus. This doesn't mean they had a belief in the afterlife, but it means they thought it important to have a process of death. 20,000, 30,000. Over that period, there seems to be an increased sense of respect for the dead, decorating them sometimes with ochre, sometimes with grave goods, a social process of death, one that employs the human remains in a way that has meaning for the people who continue to live.
So, many of the ancient rituals are in place not only for the dead, but also for those left behind and still living. Most of us hope that family and loved ones will be gathered to share that all-important last moment. That final breath, or last life force, is of particular interest to anthropologist Professor Douglas Davis.
There's interesting discussion of this idea of the breath, the life breath, leaving someone. Of course, in ancient Judaism, that life force may be being around still.
The actual moment is not seen as hugely significant. You know, you're either alive or dead.
Rabbi Julia Neuberger, who recognises that most religions, including Judaism, have much in common in their attitudes to death.
There are all sorts of folk things about evil spirits getting into the body. I think you find that in most groups, actually. I think that's not about religion. I think that's about community and about folk stuff that's made its way into Judaism. Once somebody's dead, you don't leave the body alone. You have somebody watching with them until they're buried. You have somebody reading Psalms normally. You move from this person is alive to this person is dead, and then the customs change, but your focus turns on to the living.
The living should respect the dead. What does that mean? You're not going to want to make noise. You're not going to eat. You're not going to want festivity. Why? Because you can do those things. This person, they can't do it. So as a group, don't provoke them.
So, dying is not necessarily a moment, but a period of transition. And in parts of the developed world, this time of change is starting to be carefully managed. An increasing number of people spend their last days in a care home, a type of God's waiting room. As we live longer, hospices are increasingly offering support through and supervision of the last moments on earth. I travelled to Sheffield in northern England to St Luke's Hospice, where the 100 staff were caring for some 45 people, half of whom were terminally ill. I talked with chaplain and spiritual care coordinator Mike Reeder.
Well, the hospice offers a number of things. We have a well-being service, so people can be pampered. They can have reflexology, aromatherapy, all of those sort of things. We aspire to help people to live life to the full, and death will be part of that, but it's about living life and to think about the future.
As the spiritual care coordinator, in what way are you helping them to think about the future? What is the process that you offer them?
I think the first thing is about relationship. It's about being a safe place for people to talk about things which are very intimate to them. I often describe people coming into the hospice, people who bring the knapsack of life with them. Now, for some people, they're going to tip the whole of that knapsack out, and we're going to look at all sorts of things from the past. What we're then going to do is help them to put them back. But for some people, they only just take the top layer of the knapsack and want to do some practical things. Maybe write a letter to a loved one. Maybe they want to sort their funeral arrangements out. So they only look at the top. And some people will never, ever open their knapsack of life here at all, and will never allow us to talk about what's going on. They just feel safe here, and we do everything we can for them. I work with what they give me, but actually each person does it in their own inimitable style. So some people turn their face to the wall and will be gone very quickly because they've no will to live. I've got one lady who's with me at the moment. She has set a date in her mind, which is a significant birthday for one of her children, and I know she will be here on that date because she's determined to do it.
That's fascinating. I know, you may know or not know that years ago I was locked up in Beirut as a hostage, and tragically my mother was very ill with cancer, and she apparently lived a year at least longer than the cancer doctors said was feasible. It just simply wasn't. But she obviously wanted to stay alive, at least to know if I was alive, and let alone hopefully to see me again. I wonder, do a lot of people go through a period of anger just before they pass on?
Patients will go through anger some stage. Why me? Why can I not be around to see this person grow up? And sometimes that anger causes distress. I think there is anger in the medical profession sometimes of not being able to sort things out the way they want.
There's a bit of us that believes we're going to live forever.
Rabbi Julia Neuberger visits hospitals and care homes in her community.
We still think, and our health service still thinks, that if you're dying, you're a failure. If you then go to a hospice, then you will get pretty good care, and often your family will get very good care. But the majority of us are not going to be in that position, and we're likely to die either at home or more likely actually in hospital. But one of the things that families and friends and the community more widely needs to do is give huge support to people who are caring for, living with somebody who is clearly dying. And I think as a society we could be a lot better at it.
Do you see a change in coming over people as they approach their last? Is there a sense of grace perhaps in some way descending on them? Is there anything that you've noticed as a rabbi, but also with the work you've done more broadly in the hospices?
I think it varies hugely. People, if you like, change towards the moment of death according to their upbringing. And I think that Jews have rather been brought up to fight and struggle and not particularly go for grace. And I think often I've seen Catholics look for a state of grace almost. So I think there's a real difference in what your expectation is as to what you will actually try to do.
I learn from all of my patients that I walk with and meet here. As chaplain, I'm able to help with these rites of passage. So we had a Muslim patient who died with us this week, and I was able to help the family. The patient had to be buried within the day, and we also had to help them to wash, to do all the things they needed to do. And as the son hugged me as he left and said, "Thank you for just being there and helping me." And the hospice offers a number of things. Oral history. We had one lady who said, "I really want to tell my story because I'm going to be a grandmother, but I know I shall die before the baby arrives. I want her to know who her grandmother really was." And it goes on a CD, and actually in telling the stories of life, people actually are unpacking their knapsacks a little more. And we have all sorts of other things that we can do. Memory boxes. Sometimes people want to make boxes up for their families, or they want to write letters. I have a lady at the moment who's arranged her funeral, but she has written a letter that she wants read out to her ex-husband, who she knows will be there. So we have worked through that.
Committing inner thoughts to paper or letter writing as we approach our final moments has been with us for some time.
There is a tradition which goes back well into the medieval period of people who are coming towards the end of their life writing what's called an ethical will. And this is a letter or a sermon, and it's about how they've tried to live their life and what they wish for their children and, if you like, the moral lessons that you want to leave behind. And one of the things that I have found really helpful is reinventing that tradition for modern times.
I like to talk about words against death.
Professor Douglas Davis again.
What was the weapon we could use against death? The best weapon we ever had, language. And so back to those sacred scriptures, back to those whispering our fond farewells to those we love. Language becomes so dramatically important in dealing with emotion and death.
What is the message they want to leave behind? Can they write a letter to each of their children, to their spouse, to their partner, whatever? And it's equivalent to, often young women who are dying, making a box for their children and putting treasured things in it. It's an equivalent thing. It started as a Jewish idea, but quite a lot of my members who are facing their end are doing it and finding it enormously valuable.
So while we are in God's waiting room, it seems natural we want to leave something behind. And since the experience of dying may spread over weeks or months, there may be time to plan for the end. For Chaplain Mike Reeder, he may even be present for that final moment.
Very rarely does it happen. That's a very special gift to give to somebody. I was sitting with a lady at about 2 o'clock in the morning, and she did open her eyes as I was reading a psalm. She had a very strong Christian faith and looked at me and then died very slowly and very peacefully.
That's an extraordinary thing to be part of, I guess. As a Christian, how does this work affect your faith in any way, do you think?
Yes, there are some times that I get very cross with God, especially when people are younger than I am, or the circumstances seem to be overpowering, and why is he allowing this to happen to a family that have lost somebody else already? But I also realise, for me personally, it's placed me here to be a resource, but I can give them the tools to get to the new normality, because there always has to be a new normality of life after somebody has died.
I found that very moving listening to you talk about that, and you bring a sense of extraordinary humanity to the room. At that moment of death, when the lady looked at you and then went, was there an atmosphere in the room? Is there an atmosphere when somebody goes?
When Marion died, yes, there was an atmosphere, because I think there was a bit of connection between her and me, because we'd known each other for a long time. She was now on her journey, and that she'd got the release from this body that had been holding her from what was her faith, and seeing her Maker and the Lord Jesus that she'd followed for all of her life. She was free from that. So there was an atmosphere. Sadly, sometimes people die in rooms of more than one person, so conversations are going on. So that makes the atmosphere slightly different as well. It's ideal that everybody has their own room.
Just remember thinking that my brother died. He was just a year older than me, and he was in hospital in a ward with some other older men, as it happened. Terence, my brother, said that one night they were just, lights out and going to sleep, and suddenly one of the old men started talking very loudly, and he suddenly said, "Oh, so I fancy seeing you after so long. You're here now." Then that voice went quiet, and the next morning Terence heard that old man had died, and that was it. It was almost as if he was greeting someone. And I wonder if there are moments, this might be perhaps particularly pertinent to someone with the Christian faith who might believe in the afterlife, and other traditions too. Is there a sense of that journey actually reuniting people? Do people talk about that?
Yes, and you'll often hear sometimes people saying, "Oh, I know that my dad's going to come for my mum." And quite often relatives will say to you, they opened their eyes and looked at something above in the ceiling, and they feel that somebody was there, and it gives comfort. For the people who are there, it's very important.
The idea of continuation or being unified with someone or something as we leave our time on earth has been with us throughout recorded history. Many learn through religious teachings about the way the human spirit or soul may continue its journey. Professor Douglas Davis has studied this.
The ritual of transition, the rite of passage from this world into whatever the next one is, I guess we're talking about a human perception of the transition of the soul. So the idea of a soul takes some centuries. That's a bit of a later development. And here the Greek world and the Christian world comes on board. So this idea develops. The way a person has lived in relation to God during life will, as it were, determine what's happening to them after death. And that's another reason why a moment, a point, is a difficult one. But this idea of, well, is the life force still around? What shall we say to it now for it to go its next way? Which is why things like the Tibetan Book of the Dead argue that. You see, take another aspect of Buddhism. Take the kind of Pure Land tradition which you get out in Japan and so on. It places the dying person in relation to the Heavenly Lord, in a Buddhist sense, with the desire that that Heavenly Lord should come and deliver the person from death. This is a very interpersonal, intimate relationship surrounding death.
For Buddhists, God's waiting room is a stepping stone to another life. And to learn more about that, I've come here to the Amaravati Monastery in its peaceful rural setting near the town of Berkhamsted, north of London, and I'm going to meet the abbot, Ajahn Amaro.
Well, from the Buddhist perspective, the thing that causes the most trouble for us while we're alive, while we're dying, is the habit of what we would call clinging or grasping, attachment. If you're hanging on to your possessions, or hanging on to the regrets that you have, and thinking in terms of the customary Buddhist pattern of understanding that there's a pattern of past lives and future lives that we're all experiencing, so the present life is one of a large sequence. And so the basic process of Buddhist practice and the underlying current of it is to try to end rebirth altogether.
I think this is a most fascinating concept. It's very ancient. It emerges within the Indian tradition. Buddhist tradition follows it. Sikh tradition generally follows it. But what's going on with it? What's the driver? The driver of reincarnation, as the ideas developed, was one of merit. But this idea of merit also drives the Jewish, Christian, Islamic world, which is not a reincarnation world, but is a world of life, death, judgment, and an afterlife. When in the West we pick up this concept of reincarnation, we pick it up rather positively and joyfully. In actual fact, it's something you've just got to go through and through and through and through until, of course, you gain release.
And that might sound like a negative prospect, like not being born again. Say, well, what's wrong with life? I don't mind being born again. But generally speaking, what you're trying to do with Buddhist practice is, if there is going to be another rebirth, you want it to be in as positive, beneficial and supportive and wholesome a condition as possible.
We're talking about the theme of reincarnation. Is that something that's pretty
completely exclusive to Buddhism, or is it something that is part of the general, particularly of Eastern traditions?
It's very much a part of the Indian tradition, so you find it within various strands of Hinduism and in the Sikh tradition, and also within Taoist and East Asian traditions as well. So Buddhists certainly do not have a monopoly on the idea. But also we tend to talk in terms of rebirth rather than reincarnation. And for some people, it's an immediate reappearance in a different realm of birth. There's a very quick and rapid transition. This life comes to an end, and very quickly that consciousness gravitates to a different realm of being, gravitates to another life. And so in Thailand, where I became a monk and where this particular monastery originates from, they have a custom whereby if you die suddenly, like in a car crash or in an accident, then you wouldn't be cremated straight away. What they do is that they inter the body for usually about a year, and then after a year the body is exhumed and then it's cremated. And they say, well, the understanding is that very often when somebody dies suddenly, something happened, there was a bang on the head, but they're like in some kind of a dream state, that a person, they've died, but they don't know they've died, so the consciousness remains sort of stuck close to the body, and so that they leave the body there so that consciousness has an opportunity to recognize, oh, yes, I'm no longer alive. That means I should let go and allow the process of rebirth to take place.
So, even for those who embrace the idea of reincarnation, exiting God's waiting room and moving on may not be entirely straightforward. As we have been hearing, isolating the moment of death is not simple, and there are different attitudes about what is actually happening as we draw our last breath. Certainly most people would want to pass through this fundamental experience, whether in a modern hospice or not, surrounded by their loved ones, often with a religious figure attending. Yet despite the comfort of one's faith, or indeed the care of modern medicine, death remains a frightening prospect for many of us. So, have our attitudes to leaving this world changed that much over the millennia?
In terms of the basics of a life force and our relationship with the dead, I think it's much the same. The emotional basis of fear and the transition, the coping with fear. In another sense, it's quite different. Medical science has changed the possibilities of keeping us going for a long time, and in fact even keeping us alive physically when we're already dead socially.
So I would encourage the people, if they are around friends and family members in hospice or at the bedside, what can look like that somebody is in a difficult state or they're really struggling, what can be going on internally can be very, very different.
Our program's called In God's Waiting Room, looking at the last moments of human life on Earth. But do you feel as a Buddhist that really all your life is spent in God's waiting room?
It's not just the last moment of life that I would say is a significant thing. But the whole of life is life in the waiting room, because you're not just waiting, but you're also looking at your life moment to moment, day by day, as a part of an ongoing process. It's more like God's training camp would be another term for it.
And we'll leave the last few words to the chaplain at St. Luke's Hospice, Mike Reeder.
What one of our patients said about St. Luke's is like having an extra leg to your table. I don't call this God's waiting room. Maybe if you want to use that part, but God's garden, where everybody comes and does their things and sees what they want and gets the beauty and sees the weeds and all of that sort of thing. We have a lot of tears and we have a lot of laughter, and sometimes you get the two together. For those who have a spirituality, they feel their spirit will continue to be around. For a lot of people, they're not frightened about what happens afterwards. I think this is not a waiting room at all. It's much more than that.
In God's Waiting Room was presented by me, John McCarthy, and was a sugar production for the BBC World Service.
I'm Stephen Dubner. On the next Freakonomics Radio, we explore the fine art of game theory. Here's the economist Steve Levitt.
God, game theory sucks so bad because it's so hard. Because everything is backwards in game theory. I don't even think it's worth talking about.
Let's talk about it anyway. And why Jane Austen is the godmother of game theory. That's next time